Go.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in, unfortunately, the new year. We are at 2022, and there were a couple of scheduling issues for speakers earlier in this year. And so we are now finally back. We've gotten everything worked out, and we are joined by Mike McCabe and Ken Toller, and we are really excited for their part 2 discussion on chaos and security. Just one quick housekeeping thing. We have a meetup tentatively scheduled for May, but we don't have that set yet. So just keep on the lookout for updates and more information as we post them. And we are also looking for both speakers for the year as well as leaders within this chapter. So if you are interested in either of those, please reach out to myself, Abdullah, Sean, whomever. We're all freely available through Meetup, through Twitter, whatever. DM us, message us, however, if you are interested. And without any further ado, I'm going to bring in our speakers. So yeah, like I mentioned, they're in reverse order now. So Ken Toller and Mike McCabe. So they are going to speak to us about chaos security. And do you guys want to do a full-on intro for who you are and where people can find you, or do you want to just do that as part of your bio in the actual slides?
Yeah, we have jokes to make about that, so
All
right.
as part of the
All
slide.
right.
Then
All
Abdul
right.
and I will get kicked out, and this will be your show. And like I said, I'm going to be paying attention to the comments, so I might pop in occasionally. So if I do, that means that there's a question or something's on fire. So,
Can you see the slides? Can you see the
no,
slides?
I'm about to bring them in now. So just give me 1 second.
Cool.
There it is.
All right. Well, let's get started.
rock and roll.
No idea who's out there. Hopefully someone. Hi, Mom. So this is Cloud Security Part 2, The Chaos Continues. As Ben said, I'm Mike McCabe, so why listen to us? So I'm Mike McCabe. I'm a cloud security consultant. My job is to come into places, tell the folks what's wrong, how to fix it, and why everything is terrible. And my co-presenter.
Hey, I'm Ken Toller. I'm back in the consulting game since we've put this talk together for part 2. And since I've been back in, I guess it's been almost 4 years now since I made the switch out of corporate again. And I've been fortunate enough to take on challenges in AppSec, modernization, DevSecOps, cloud security, and more recently blockchain and cryptocurrency. And so that's going to be a portion of this talk and how cloud is used there. I've worked for fintech and a variety of startups. Prior to that, I spent all that time on the blue side trying to build a security program and working through that. So this is just lessons from that. And this is me again, blue team life. And we can move on to the next one. And this is basically my day to day now. Just running right into the junk pile. So hope you enjoy these stories, and we'll jump right in with our 4.
Yeah. So when we originally put this talk together, Ken and I were talking about some of the experiences that we had at different places, either companies we worked for or as consultants, clients we worked with. And we started with 3 financials in the first iteration of this talk. And now we're up to 4. Yes, that is an entire one more. So the first 3 we talked about was Bart's Binary Bank, Lisa's Lending, and Homer's Homeowners. And if you haven't figured out by now, there is a Simpsons theme. So if you don't like that, you better leave now. So the 4th one that we added was Maggie's Mint, and Ken will talk about them later. But just diving into things, these are all stories about places we worked, clients we worked with, or places we worked as Blue Team, and kind of what we learned and what we wanted to share with other folks out there to hopefully learn from our mistakes, learn from the growing pains that people feel in the cloud, and kind of some lessons learned that could be useful. So to start out, Homer's Homeowners, they are a large financial company. Been in the cloud for 10 plus years, kind of one of the OGs of the financials in the cloud. So they have hundreds of applications, if not thousands, highly regulated, and they're struggling with the complexity of kind of an older cloud environment along with a very large footprint. So when they started out, things looked very straightforward. They started out before CloudFront was actually a thing, but you just had the typical web servers. You had your databases. Things came in from the internet. You had your basic VPCs. Things were simple back then, relatively simple. But of course, as AWS scales, they release new services. They add new features, and the network scales out. Things start looking like this. So much more complexity. It's much harder to reason about any one thing. And that's just kind of the natural progression as companies move more and more to the cloud as things get larger and more complex. So what do you do? What do you do in this scenario when you have, a very large and complex cloud environment to work with? You have Homer's look on your face. And in the meantime, security, that's us. We're always trying to, run along with all of the application developers, all the infrastructure folks who are spinning up these new services as AWS and Azure and GCP spin up new services. We're trying to keep up with all these new services and make sure that they're deployed in a secure way. So there's always new services, there's new patterns to support, new networking patterns, and I think we're still struggling with kind of inadequate security tooling in a lot of these areas. So we're trying to keep up, and we're also trying to learn at the same time. Cloud is relatively new, and cloud changes all the time. So as a security person, you have to keep up with what's changing out there and make sure you can speak intelligently to it and understand the complexity of it. So we have to learn at the same time as doing our job. So what's working for Homer's homeowners? So they're doing a good job of building out patterns, how applications consume different services. They have an account structure that says, what does my network look like? What does IEM look like? And they have baselines being built out to say, okay, this is what things should look like, and here's a deviation from what that baseline is, so they can understand what it is and go and fix it. So they have some really good, solid kind of baselines in place, basic building blocks for a secure cloud infrastructure. What's not working for them though? So a big issue is not having a uniform kind of deployment pipeline for how things get to the cloud. So you might have some CI/CD that does some parts of it. You might have multiple CI/CDs. You could use native AWS tools. You could use Jenkins with keys. They might have multiple ways to deploy things. And so that always makes kind of unifying how things are deployed much harder. It's harder to secure your deployments if you have to support multiple ways. And of course, there's always those keys or overprivileged users out there that have too much access that can change things and not use your unified deployment process. Number of alerts, of course, when you're talking about hundreds of accounts, you're going to have hundreds of accounts, thousands of EC2s, thousands of databases, thousands of networks you have to manage. You're going to have a huge amount of misconfiguration, and you're going to have a lot of alerts. So how do you deal with that number of alerts, and how do you you can't scale up to dealing with this number of alerts? So how do you deal with kind of prioritizing those and fixing all those? And that goes along with remediation, which is can be very difficult. It's very easy to click a few buttons and fix things in the cloud. It's not always easy to track down who owns something and get them to do it and make sure there's no kind of production impact on that workload if you do change something. So how do we solve this? And this is just my opinion, Ken's opinion, but we go to the source. We go where everything kind of gets built out. So two very buzz terms these days, infrastructure as code and security as code. So infrastructure as code, a lot of folks are familiar with this, but it enables you to do fast and consistent infrastructure deployment. You can remove manual processes where people go in and click buttons, and you can really integrate security well into infrastructure as code. And that's where security as code comes in, where people are really trying to move from, we have a set of requirements and you have to meet these requirements, and X number of ways to we have a set of requirements and we have code to enforce those requirements, and you don't even have to think about it other than writing your Terraform or CloudFormation, whatever it is, in the correct way. And these can scale to your cloud program because there's no person going through and clicking buttons or looking at spreadsheets. You just have this deploying out and it's running against your CI/CD, your deployment process. And it doesn't rely on constant security input. So you just have automation that does this for you. So some examples of infrastructure as code. You have CloudFormation from AWS, you have Terraform, and you have Azure solution as well. So different kind of variants of infrastructure as code, but it's a very mature, the technologies are very mature, definitely some nuances to it, but there's mature ways to automatically deploy your infrastructure and codify your infrastructure so you're not doing manual deployments anymore. So this is an example, and myself and Ken have worked on large Terraform implementations before, where this is kind of what it looks like, where you have your source code that sits in something like GitHub or Bitbucket, whatever, as long as it's not a zip file on someone's laptop, sits in some kind of source control. You have your Terraform. You can use Terraform Cloud, you can use Terraform Enterprise, or this could be a different pipeline. But in this example, we have Terraform that runs your plan, that determines what's going to be built out, and then Terraform's tool for this is Sentinel. Sentinel is your policy as code framework that will run all of its checks against your planned infrastructure, and it'll basically say if it meets the requirements or doesn't, and if it doesn't, you can't move on from that. But if it does, you move on to the apply step, and then you have your infrastructure built out. So some of the benefits I've kind of talked about, but you write it once, enforce it everywhere. It's not something you have to write write multiple times over and over again. If these are written well and they're tested well, they're very high fidelity, as in you're not going to get a lot of false positives. These rules are checking very detailed parameters on a very specific resource. So it's not using a fuzzy regex to check something. You should be writing these where you're checking for the exact values that you're looking for. So these shouldn't be throwing a huge amount of false positives. Very, very customizable. Most of these frameworks that we talk about are, actual coding languages that you can write to write your logic and how you want to parse data out and how you want to enforce things. So it's very customizable. It's not cookie cutter. You can write things to have any kind of logic that you really want to enforce your policies. You can build in exception processes. You can say certain apps shouldn't be required to follow this rule, or some use case might not follow that rule. And they're also very fast. At least when in our use cases, we have projects that run hundreds of Sentinel rules in the matter of seconds. So they're not like your traditional security tools that might take 2 days to run against an application build. These are very fast tools, which is good because it gives you very instant feedback to say whether your infrastructure as code is secure or meets the compliance requirements. So quick example, this is from HashiCorp Sentinel, but this is a very basic example. So you're looking at, what type of AWS instance can you set up, and this rule will look at your plan file. It will look at the different AWS instances, which is the resource that Terraform uses to create AWS EC2 instances, and it'll basically say, is it within this allowed types array? If it's not in that array, then basically fail out and don't let the build continue. So there's a lot of comments in this file, but it looks like it's about 7 actual lines of code to enforce the instance type that someone can use. So that shows that it's a very powerful and very succinct framework to use to enforce these things. So you don't have to write hundreds and hundreds or thousands of lines of code to do these things. It's very straightforward, very small, very succinct. Another example is Cfn Lint, which is a linting framework from AWS for CloudFormation templates. This is a linting tool, but I've actually seen it used as a security tool as well, because again, it's just parsing CloudFormation, looking for certain variables, and then checking those variables for the right properties, basically. This one's a little more complex than the last one, but again, it's relatively straightforward. The last example is semgrep. Semgrep is a not just infrastructure as code security tool, but it's used in application security and used as a source code tool against a lot of different languages and frameworks. But there's some semgrep patterns that are some rules that have been built out for AWS and GCP and Azure. And again, they're very simple, very easy to write, not thousands of lines of code, but relatively straightforward. So you don't have to stress about having to write hundreds of lines of code just to do one thing. So how do you take this and scale this? So I think one thing that security teams are not used to as much is working in a kind of dev/operations role. And so I think the person you have to get comfortable with is your security team is now doing development and they have a project that affects production. So you have to make sure that it's a well-run project. You have to treat it like a development project. You have to have release processes. You have to have approvals. You have to test, because if you write infrastructure as code rules and those rules for some wrong reason break production deployments, your security tool just stops them from going to production for maybe either an error or because there was a false positive. So you have to treat this project like it is a true production project, because you're going to affect everyone else's production deployments. And you need a lot of patterns and subject matter expertise. You have to have people who really understand the AWS services that you're deploying, or Azure or GCP, and then write the rules based on that. And based on your patterns internally for how you deploy out these services. So it's a very powerful way of approaching security, but I'm not going to say it is, it's not super easy as just throwing a box in your network. This is something that takes a lot of time to spin up and takes a lot of expertise to do. And another thing to think about with this is when you move to something like, say, Terraform, and you start offering out Terraform to developers and infrastructure folks, how do you want them to consume it? Do you want it to be a playground where they have a lot more freedom to build things the way they want to build it? Or do you build paved paths where they just consume kind of your patterns, your modules, your overall strategy for how they should use Terraform? That's kind of a strategic decision. And you can, of course, be somewhere in between, but you have to make that decision about how much flexibility and freedom you want to give developers from the get-go. And so how can things go wrong? You have to understand, how your users are using cloud services. So if you go in with one idea about how they consume EC2 and you make some assumptions that say they're not using SSH keys, or they're sitting in one subnet that doesn't have access to something, and so you've just now blocked them from deploying into a subnet that they need to be into because they do need access to something. You have to make sure when you're building this stuff that you understand their use cases and make sure that you're not just completely blocking those. You have to be able to fix these issues when they do come up quickly, get to the bottom of what is causing the issue, whether it is an incorrect rule or it's an actual error somewhere, and fix that rapidly. Like I said before, your production environment could be blocking their production environment, so it's important to be able to fix these things quickly. One thing that I've also seen kind of go wrong in infrastructure as code security projects is sometimes you move from the let's secure the infrastructure with this tool to let's secure our applications, let's secure our networks, let's do all these different things. And I think you have to look at it as this project, this tool secures how you build infrastructure. It does secure your networks in the sense of it will build them out to adhere to your kind of patterns and your compliance requirements, but it can't do everything for you. And so you have to make sure that the scope doesn't get too too large for what this tool does, or it's just going to be a bad fit, because infrastructure as code tools, they run against pre-deployed, Terraform or CloudFormation templates. They don't have a live view of the environment. They can't do everything, and they can't tell if your application has vulnerabilities in it, for instance. Not initially. I'm sure you could do some crazy stuff to make that work, but you just have to think about what you really want to get out of using this and make sure that you're kind of staying within that scope. And like I talked about before with homeowners, if you don't have a unified deployment model, as in one way to get to the cloud, there's no point in having an infrastructure as code project, because if people can just bypass your pipeline that has that enabled, they will do that, so they don't have to adhere to your requirements and get to the cloud without all that annoying security. So you have to make sure you have one way to get to the cloud, and you don't have people with privileged access deploying things out manually or using other pipelines. So kind of some takeaways from my experience working with homeowners. You can't scale out of cloud security issues with more people, or more spreadsheets or more meetings. You have to kind of fix things at the beginning of where the problems are really introduced, and you have to make your security scale with your infrastructure, with your app teams, with the overall organization that's consuming these services, or you'll never succeed. And now I'll kick it over to Ken.
All right, thank you. So after coming from homeowners, we're moving to a different type of organization, Lisa's Lending, which you can think of as kind of this combination of maybe 5 to 10 organizations in the fintech and finance or FinServe space. And obviously, all names are changed to protect the innocent here. But if you have seen our last talk, and we spoke about Lisa's Lending, and this was an organization with a startup culture doing lots of innovative things in finance that was hungry for new things, just starting to get bound by regulation and partnerships and compliance. And they were just starting the cloud journey, moving from on-prem into the cloud, picking things up out of the data center and going into AWS. And they had a ton of smart people on the tech side, great ideas, a good solid DevOps team that knew how to generate infrastructure as code, dedicated security teams, engineering teams, and they were trying to push the envelope inside of the fintech space. So if we go down to the next slide, we talked about in the last time we worked through these, the depth around the major hurdles in finance and fintech being complexity of the existing organization and what that looks like going to the cloud. So how do we take the things that we did that were really fast to create and move them into something that is structured in the cloud? So decisions like what services to move, how to move the apps, what architecture is, all that overwhelming stuff. Then we talked about the frustration of regulation and how hard it can be to take all of that on in, say, a year when you're a startup that needs to get funding and convince folks that you are secure and that you have a good team and that you are compliant. And then finally, just general frustration that comes with dealing with legacy systems, both legacy systems that come from the path that you took to get where you are, and also the legacy systems that exist inside of some of the partners that you're trying to work with, like banks or larger financial firms that have mainframes or some app that runs in the basement of someone's house. We also talked about the niche organizations that handle things like bank statements and credit and account history and identity, the LexisNexis of the world, asset verification, and having such a small number of vendors that folks rely on and consistently go to in the industry. You almost have to look at this like a supply chain. I saw supply chain in the comments. This is very similar to that, or library management. How do we handle our vendors in this way? And when you're not a development or a tech company, the DIY and build it yourself type of mentality may not be an option. So these legacy systems combined with regulatory compliance for a particular line of business, whether that's PCI or SOX or SOC 2, in addition to anything business valuable partners that you want to work with, put you through. And so we started to talk through those, and by doing this and sort of addressing these things and getting into a place where compliance matters, we ended up with the next little bit here. Waiting for that slide. Waiting for that slide. We reached a point where we got all these things into the cloud and reached this like sort of confident, trained team that basically went from knowing nothing about cloud to getting them hands-on experience and comfort in the cloud and providing confidence to all the teams in the organization and working in the cloud with projects over the course of a year, all while establishing a good security reputation. And we have the details of that in the first talk. So if we kind of move on from that, um, one of the things I also talked about, a lesson learned, and I just faced this this exact layer diagram yesterday with on a client call. Talked about this last time, so I will continue to harp on this until I never see it again. And this came up in another meeting with clients, and it continues to be relatively misunderstood, right? Because in general, this is how business partners look at security responsibility, but it's not entirely true at face value. If you look at things like SaaS, we basically have no responsibility when we talk about security according to this diagram, but there is always the configuration of those things to consider and the misclassification of a cloud provider. And I mean that, like, we have to remember that AWS isn't the only cloud we talk about migrating to, right? We're talking about the Salesforce of the world, the SaaS of the world. If you look at platform as a service, let's say something like Lambda or EKS or the equivalent of an Elastic Kubernetes service on other cloud providers, especially when we talk about blockchain in the cloud, applications and data aren't the only components you need to secure. So there's this underlying platform configuration to think about, and an entire security guide, that is published by folks on just configuring some of their services. In the example of AWS, there's an entire security guide around configuring EKS. So you do have a responsibility of your own platform when it comes to configuration and understanding the security concepts in each of these layers. Obviously, with infrastructure as a service, you still have some storage and networking responsibility according to this diagram with VPCs and EPS encryption. So with these layers of abstraction, you're still responsible for understanding the service that you're using and the configurations of those services and how they interact with any of the lower level infrastructure as code in your respective cloud service provider. So just like PSA, I always do in this talk, because if you see this, challenge folks on it and make sure that security is considered at each of these layers, even if somebody tries to offload it to the cloud service provider. So if you recall in the last talk, the way that we sort of tackled this, and the one key takeaway we wanted folks to have is you need to focus on enabling and enhancing security protections, as opposed to coming at it as like a security gate or a security control. And so you need to spend a lot of time initiating these collaborative initiatives. And in our case, this was key management and secret management and stability. And so with the key management and secret management piece, we talked about doing magical things like auto rotation of keys and secrets and zero knowledge access, and creating break glass accounts that enable engineers to stop worrying about getting access or SSH access to the servers because they didn't need it, right? Security was able to take a breath of not finding secrets in config files. DevOps gets equipped to recover quickly and rotate secrets on things like application reboot, as opposed to having to manually change a secret. And then compliance is happy about short expiration times on secrets and proof that secrets were rotated quickly and seamlessly. So it's basically taking the tech and making it work for your compliance. We also did this kind of thing through stability by ensuring that failovers in cloud architecture were designed with resiliency and business continuity in mind. So we take those business continuity and resiliency requirements, and rather than just meet the checkbox, we actually talk about how we can meet this with technology and automation. And so we focused on attention to denial of service response and load testing. And this allowed us to sort of sneak in and leverage security and monitoring tools that were all part of a project that had the title of stability of the entire platform. So basically, where does security fit into the initiatives that you're talking about, and how can the security decisions that you make actually enable and enhance the functional requirements for what you're doing? So those were the lessons that we learned. So if we move on to the next slide, it's probably the question is always, okay, what happened? And the last time we talked about how cloud, all of this can create this cloud hell. We talked about how finance could really be this churn that ultimately fintechs are challenged by. We referenced how handcuffs of just compliance and regulation and legacy systems really take the wind out of your sails. And if you spend enough time focusing on it, like, where do you land? You land here potentially, and this is where we landed. We kind of failed. Mike's missing my beat again. There we go. All right. But if you spend enough time focused inwardly without an eye towards the intent behind all of the factors that you're talking about, you can kind of end up being the very thing you were frustrated to begin with. And I'll explain how that happened. This is kind of an organization focused primarily on compliance over security, which we never want to do in terms of a checkbox security. But if you, what kind of ended up happening with us is we gained this confidence because we had all these cool ways to meet compliance and actually do security. And it gave us this sense of confidence, getting people with more hands-on experience, but it kind of left us with nowhere to go. So how did that happen? Go to the next one. As all teams gained more and more confidence in the cloud and got more hands on experience, they started to create their own very, very positive narrative. After all, we're hitting all of our compliance goals. We're checking all the boxes with our partners and the finance folks and the compliance folks. We're tuning things, and it wasn't a priority to go anywhere because there was no perceivable or measured gap in the compliance or the metrics other than like vuln management. So that's where focus started to go to, and that's not really a bad thing. But this meant that all of the new goals that were coming out weren't always aligned with security because we didn't know how to measure it. And one of the major things that happened is that the exploration of new services or capabilities weren't always aligned with security as long as the compliance requirement was met. And teams were confident now with that overconfidence to go off on their own and do some of the things that we've taught them to do. They were more focused on reaching the summit, and it kind of put us back into this place where teams were on and on moving into a more secure environment, or what they perceived as a more secure environment. So if we go to the next slide. So we kind of ended up in this, right, where it's like we get more and more confident, we feel great, we kind of go for that summit, and then we end up like the security goat here, like, hey, we can help, bring my walkie-talkie up, like let's go back to the drawing board and see what we can do. So if we go to the next one, how do we do this? I think that the main thing is we focused on our failures were that we focused on compliance as a baseline. Even though we weren't focusing on it as a checkbox security baseline, we still used it as the measurement tool. So when you vastly overcome, this what is on the line item, you really have nothing left to go back to mature that particular area. So when we talked about auto rotation of secrets and going through all of that kind of thing, it never really encouraged us to go back and see how we could improve that area. It became an inward focus of success rather than improvement. So it was like, how do we reach the goal? And then there were lacks of gap. There were gaps in the measurement over time. So to change the viewpoint, I think what we wanted to do is find something that allowed us to not be driven by money, right? Because it kind of takes us out of the security driven mindset. Obviously, money is always going to be some component of it. We don't want to be driven by compliance in any fashion in terms of making decisions on the security controls. And I'll expand on that a little bit, but you obviously want to meet compliance. You just don't want to use that as the primary driver, or it feels very hollow if you use it as the primary driver. We wanted something that created actionable output. Like, if we're going to measure something, how do we take what we've measured and then create something to do out of it? We wanted to continue to focus on what worked for us, which was the team-based success. Basically, how do we collaborate and make sure that everyone is moving in the same direction? We wanted to focus on maturity over like success criteria. So we wanted to make sure that we were continually improving and that we were continually getting better at what we were doing. And we wanted to allow some flexibility in goal setting. So if something didn't apply to us, we wanted the option to say, that's not really good for us right now. Even if we can measure it and we're low, maybe as an organization, the risk is low and we don't care. We also wanted something that the team and the organization could self-assess. So we evaluated a couple of frameworks to use here, which we'll go through on the next slide. We looked at the OWASP SAM, the DevSecOps maturity model, and IONS. These are all great to use if it fits in your particular area. We ended up going with OWASP SAM, and I know it's not cloud specific, but what really aligned with some of the teams here, and this is kind of where most of this goes on the cloud side, is that there was an application security focus in things that folks were already familiar with, like governance, deployment, build, CI/CD, and those were all things that usually have some cloud flavor to them, whether it's building the service, doing the infrastructure as code, automation. There's also the cloud security maturity model that by IANS that you could sort of work in with this, but there's no limit to like which ones of these you can use. The thing about a maturity model is that it allows you to go beyond compliance requirements and focus on things like speed, efficiency, and capability rather than do you just meet the security bar. So with the OWASP SAM, we kind of like the idea that there was no final score, and that there was some flexibility in what you could do or didn't maybe want to do. And so the big wins in terms of alignment there were, and in terms of moving forward, were the infrastructure as code bits and the provisioners associated with that for a few reasons. We realized like we weren't necessarily measuring those, and this gave us a method to do that. This allowed us to incorporate things like SAST into the project through items like automation and SemGrep that Mike mentioned earlier. It allowed us to focus on automation of security tooling, specifically deployments, and not just like I automatically scan things when I deploy them, which I think is always the misconception here in terms of what security automation is. The really nice thing was that it sets you with distinct criteria to measure each level with. And so if you're looking at it, it gives you those action items out of the box and allows some flexibility and interpretation there for you to be more or less mature than what's just listed on the page. Again, just to get out of the compliance thing, it provided us with a new set of goals that we could track over time and mature over time. So I think the lesson here is when you're changing, I don't know if I have another slide actually on this, but if you're changing your perspective, you may want to look outside of the compliance frameworks, find a maturity model, and align your cloud security practice with your application security practice through vehicles such as automation and evaluation of your infrastructure as code. So you can take those application security mindsets and apply them to things that are deploying infrastructure. And I can't tell you how huge that was in establishing a new baseline that one wasn't bound to an external party, and two allowed us to measure and continue to improve without worrying about an audit. Right, we were self-driven. And I think that the key is finding something that the organization responds to, whether it's these three or anything else. And so with that, we can turn it over to Mike again for Bart's binary bank.
All of these are very, very wordy.
Yeah, very alliterative.
Exactly. We're very fancy. Yeah, so the next kind of company group that I want to talk about is Bart's binary bank. So this is a fintech, and fintechs are all the rage these days. There's a lot of them that have grown very quickly, and it's an interesting space to work because you're both a startup, so that means you don't have a lot of the like well built out process. You don't have a huge compliance team like most banks have. You don't have a huge security team like most banks have, but you do have a ton of sensitive customer data. And you do manage money, and you're also very regulated. So you have all the problems of larger banks, but you don't have any of the kind of formal infrastructure that those banks have. So they kind of got to the point in cloud security is to we're in the cloud, we're cloud first. They never had an on-prem. They never had a data center to build stuff out in. So we're in the cloud, but where do we start with our cloud security? And this is something that I think a lot of folks, not just fintechs, kind of struggle with is where do you start? And like a lot of companies, their priorities were driven by things like audits. Like I said, they're a well-regulated company, so they're going to have internal, external audits. And so a lot of times those audits, when you have gaps, those are going to drive priorities for the company. Which is, an audit finding and security are not always the same thing. A lot of times they're not. But unfortunately, you can't just say no to most audits and most auditors because there's usually way worse consequences if you do. And of course, they lack the security tooling and staff. Relatively small fintech, and they don't have an infinite budget, and they always have short timelines, because in the startup world, you always have less time than you need. So some of the common issues that we see with groups like this are kind of the basics. They don't have those baseline things in place. Logging is always an issue. Not having CloudTrail enabled, not having that monitored or being stored in the right place, not having kind of your other logs enabled for different services. Cloud encryption, it's not the biggest deal in the world. It'll always get dinged on, an audit or a security assessment. If you trust AWS to manage all of your infrastructure, not sure how much you need to worry about them walking off with hard drives, but it is a thing to be done. It does reduce risk some, and it's always going to come up in audits, and it's very straightforward to do. There's some benefits in the IAM side as well that you can use encryption to add as another layer of access control. So it's always worth doing. It's very easy to do, and you're always going to get dinged. But these are things that we see. And then lastly, managing users, managing identity in the cloud is always something that people struggle with, large or small, but especially smaller companies that don't have, a strong identity provider. They don't have identity automation that onboards and offboards people. You see a lot of these issues where stuff is just not cleaned up. And that can have pretty big impacts if you don't have good offboarding processes and you don't have good monitoring. So these are the kind of common issues we see. And the solution that a lot of places end up with is they just buy a tool. They'll buy a tool, they'll throw it in their environment, they'll give it full access to their AWS accounts, and it'll just start churning findings, and they'll have a red dashboard to say, here's everything that is wrong with your environment. And if you have a decent sized cloud environment, even if it's one large account or multiple accounts, you're going to end up with quite a few findings, just like every security tool. Security tools are built to flag things. That's just, that's the bread and butter of security tools, is finding what's wrong. And so these companies end up buying these tools and don't really know what to do with the information that comes out of them, don't know how to prioritize the findings. And sometimes really bad findings can be kind of buried in these tools, and they just get ignored because it's not tied to an audit finding. It's not tied to what the security team might be focused on right now. It's not tied to the latest article that the CSO forwarded everyone at 9 p.m. on a Sunday saying, do we have coverage for this? But a lot of bad things can still be buried in these tools, and no one's really paying attention to it. So it's kind of like that lighthouse that no one really looks at. So you really have to, it's true for every security tool, if it's network, if it's application, if it's cloud, whatever it is. If you just buy it and you throw it in there, but you don't tune it, you don't have your remediation workflows, you don't have people, pulled into its use, it's a pretty useless thing to have. So you have to make sure it's more than just purchasing and integrating the tool. It has to be, it really has to be a whole process and a whole integration with your overall security team and operations teams. Another big issue that we see, you see this at small companies, you see it at big companies, but data sprawl. And what I mean by that is, you have data, say it's database backups, or it's just, flat files that are sitting in one place and they get copied to another place. The data science team pulls them onto an S3 bucket so that they can import it into like their ML model. And you just have data that just spreads constantly over time. No one ever deletes data. They just keep copying it to new places. And there are some tools out there that give you visibility and alerting on these things. Not a lot of folks use them. Even Macy, people have started using that more in AWS, but it's pretty expensive and there's still false positives on it. So it's a very tough issue to solve. And again, when we're talking about the context of a fintech, they're going to have, social security numbers. They might have credit reports. They might have credit applications. They're going to have potentially spending habits, all those types of things. So they have very sensitive data. And if you don't have a strong data protection process and policy and people actually enforcing it, data is just going to spread everywhere. And that is just more so in the cloud, where things are so easy to move around, and storage is so cheap that you just take another copy, or just move something to another place because you have a use case for it. So it's something to watch out for, especially in the cloud. And a note on multi-cloud. My opinion on this has evolved over time, and I think there has been some talk about people are going to be multi-cloud so that they can not have vendor lock-in, and they can they can move to a different cloud if prices go up too high, or they just don't want to be too tightly coupled to AWS. I think that whole premise is just crazy, because unless you're just using bare bones EC2s and databases, like you're locked into your clouds once you start using them. Like, try to move all of your IAM policies, roles, users out of one cloud infrastructure into another one, and it'll be a nightmare. So I don't think that's the way to think about multi-cloud. I think how it's evolved these days is people think of it more as take the best of what each cloud gives me, and try to have kind of a uniform adoption process. So that means like uniform ways of doing identity, uniform ways of doing logging, of monitoring, like have all those things be more or less centralized, but use the services in those different clouds that are kind of the best of breed. And that's what I'm seeing. That's what I'm seeing more of these days, which I think makes perfect sense. Different clouds have different kind of benefits, and I think the only challenge to security folks is, okay, you're struggling to secure an AWS deployment, and your company says, well, we're going to also start using Azure services, and now you have to manage Azure identity, Azure encryption, Azure data, creating baselines, enforcing baselines, all those things. And so it's a lot of work for an already strapped security team. So it's something to have a mind on, and something to think forward about as well. So what do you do when you're in the situation where you're taking a big dive into the cloud, and you kind of have to build up the security under tight timelines? So I think good security is really good hygiene of a lot of other things. I think this is true in all facets of security. So good application security, I think, is a lot to do with good dev processes and integrating security into it, more than it is just a whole different kind of function. So the same is true in the cloud. You need to have your basics covered before you can really get into the more interesting, more nuanced stuff. So having logging really well sorted out, and that means not just having logs turned on and hitting an S3 bucket, but how are you consuming those? How are you going to use those logs if an incident does happen? Identity and federation, where are you going to centrally manage your users? What's your user management kind of process and life cycle? And then how do you integrate identity into your different cloud environments? How do you break up kind of user privileges so that people aren't given too much access? Alerting, same thing. You're going to get tons and tons of alerts. How are you going to handle all those alerts? How are you going to prioritize them? Who's going to be responsible for taking those on, so that when someone logs into the root account without at 2 a.m, someone's going to get alerted and know what to do. That's a terrible situation, but if it happens, what is your actual process, and who's going to be on the phone to fix these issues? And then also the deployment process, like I talked about with homeowners, not easy things to say. You need to have that deployment process figured out and unified, and that's where you inject security into your cloud process. But if you don't have that in place, then again, you're just always trying to fight the different leaks of how things get to the cloud, and not just stemming the bleeding in one place. So now to kick it back to Ken.
Here, Ken, before you start off, there are a few questions in the chat. I was wondering if you could take a chance to answer them.
Yeah, let's do it.
You mentioned OWASP SAM as a good guide, and you mentioned having some basic understanding of AppSec and CI/CD as an example. Are there any other baseline guides to ensure teams can do this and really do it well?
Baseline guides as in other maturity models? If that's the question, I think the DevSecOps maturity model is good. I've also seen like the ISO 27002 guidelines for 27001 used. That was a kind of a unique scenario where we made it up as we kind of went along, just using that as a guideline. But really, just finding something that you think was going to drive the organization without necessarily doing it just to hit the compliance goal. I think that's the thing, is like it's trying to find something that's going to help you set the priorities. The IAN's cloud security maturity model is also good if it's more cloud focused. We just liked OWASP SAM probably because I'm more partial to something that's AppSec focused in the organization, in the fintech organizations that it really worked in, and I just found a lot of good with that. It's also been helping in some of the blockchain stuff we're about to talk about.
Cool.
So,
Thanks. Yeah, that was more than good enough, I think.
cool. And let me know if I didn't answer the question. I'll hit it again later. So Maggie's Mint. So Maggie's Mint is kind of this collaborative scenario from, I'd say, about now probably 20 projects, blockchain cryptocurrency projects that I've been able to work on over the last year or so. And what this tries to do is tie together some of the common themes across that as a data set. So usually the story is similar to Maggie, something like, Maggie has decided to spin up this blockchain or crypto project where she has a new token. We're going to call it Doggy Coin after her favorite pup, Santa's little helper. She wants to allow the creation and trading of these various tokens on her platform, and she wants to provide user accounts holding some sort of metadata for all of her friends and family so that they can not only trade on the platform but also maybe have some communication and be social and identified. And that means she not only needs a connection to the blockchain, but she also needs to develop a web app and infrastructure that integrates and communicates with it. And I think that this theme is not commonly thought about when you think about DeFi and all of these decentralized concepts we talk about when we talk about blockchain, because there are other organizations that are using blockchain in a way that they're more catering towards the user experience rather than going down the DeFi route of really focusing on decentralization. It's basically another pathway to use the same type of technology. And there's some of these Web 2 primitives that are still used in these kinds of organizations. So in my experience, I've come across 2 or maybe 3 schools of thought in the next slide that um, basically that there's these organizational themes. First of all, one is that it's typically a small team, sometimes as small as 2 people. There's sometimes a lack of cloud knowledge and support because the focus of those development teams is on crypto, and there's an extreme trust in the blockchain as secure. And so the client side doesn't necessarily become a concern, or the cloud doesn't really become a concern, because when they're publishing a security review, most of their community is worried about the audit associated with the smart contract or the backend system, the blockchain system. And the last part is usually a lack of a dedicated security team. And we saw this in like startup world, where it's mostly function driven in terms of who's the new hire. And we're already, sort of understaffed as an industry. This just continues to compound that. So next slide. So I think there are kind of 3, I'll say, organizational personas, and probably the first is kind of like it's all on the user. We just need to make sure that the contract, the smart contract, does what we say, and if the user makes a mistake, it's on them. We provide the access, but nothing really prevents the user from interacting with the contract directly, and we publish all of our code so it's open source. They can read it if they want to. That's obviously not the greatest view, because it takes a relatively skilled person to review it for security and feel comfortable with it. So that's why there are auditors doing this kind of work. I think the second sort of persona I see is folks that just don't know that client applications written in JavaScript can have issues. I mean, I think that comes as a surprise to most web app or application security folks. But some of these engineers, they believe that because the client is interacting with the contract directly, basically through this browser-based application, that as long as the contract is secure and the back end is secure, that they are generally unfamiliar with the possibility of things like cross-site scripting or client-side attacks or man in the middle or man in the browser. And they may sort of lean towards the guy in the suit over here that is like, we don't care about the user. But other folks in this category just aren't familiar with AppSec in general because they began their careers in smart contracts. I mean, this is like some of these projects are folks in high school, like making money on this type of on this type of work, and they're just not informed. And I think it's our role to sort of inform them. And lastly, are folks that truly do care about their users, their experience, and the security of their product and the protection of their brand, but they just don't know how to identify weaknesses beyond the scope of blockchain and smart contracts because that's what the industry is telling them that they need. So perhaps most of their dev team is focused on building the next latest and greatest blockchain technology or crypto technology. And they're so low level that they're not familiar with the common stuff, the things that we hear about all the time and that we've come to be familiar with over the last decade. And I found that these sorts of folks are really great at things like crypto and creating contracts and understanding finance concepts and DeFi and all of this new technology and stuff. And they're not so great at cloud infrastructure because they're not exposed to it. And I mean, that's kind of a broad brush. I'm not saying that's everyone, but it's sort of like being a Java developer and then someone thrusts you into COBOL and says, go. So it's kind of, that type of mentality if you can think about working on that. So on the next slide, typical setup looks kind of like this. It's oversimplified, obviously, still protecting the innocent. You might have like a client web app that runs in the browser running on like S3 or something. Your typical setup that the user is interacting with. And that JavaScript client is maybe on a container or an S3 bucket. Interacts with the smart contract on the blockchain using some SDK over Web3. And then it also interacts with some backend API components that you've created to establish some of the Web2 components of whatever you're doing. Maybe it's the social network or whatever. And so what happens here? Why does this happen? Why do we get to this stage? We can go to the next one. I think, we as security folks still kind of get drawn to this mentality of beating people up when they do things poorly. And so as an industry, I think we have to do better. We have to understand that this is a new playground, and we're coming to it with knowledge that may not exist there. And so I think it's our duty to sort of work with them and try to get to be in a more collaborative relationship with cryptocurrency and blockchain teams. And so, what can we do to kind of like help these blockchain organizations? I think the big thing is threat modeling has been something that's been really effective for us in conducting these with organizations. One, because it's not necessarily something that they've done before. In fact, I would say probably 70%, a number out of the air, don't have never walked through a threat model of their product or project or thought through it. They probably have like a white paper or a light paper is pretty common, but it's more user focused or concept focused, almost like what we're doing that's cool in the market. And so if you start with the threat model and start with the basics, and even Stride is okay. I mean, some folks will argue that Stride doesn't apply to blockchain, but I think I disagree. And if you get them to start working through that, or if you have your own threat modeling methodology that you want to work through, you will inherently come up with a diagram. Most projects don't have this or don't have any kind of architecture diagram. And you'll most likely be able to create an inventory of assets and actors and connections and identify things that they may not be aware of. You'll be able to walk through those threats, but I would assume nothing. Like assume they have no idea, what security is and what applies to them or doesn't apply to them, because you'll be surprised at the surprises that you will bring to the table. And I think that if you're working on a cryptocurrency or blockchain product, this is a really good place to start, even before a code review. If you can convince somebody to say, "Hey, look, like let's take a beat on the audit. Like let's walk through the product and like draw this out conceptually first," and that will help you on the analysis side with looking for things that organization cares about, that project cares about, and not necessarily focusing like on what becomes the hottest cryptocurrency or blockchain threat of the day. And we're all guilty of following those. So what's the next one? So if you're interested in crypto and you are a security practitioner, application security, cloud security, or whatever, how do you join the crypto party? I am like super excited to have found a Simpsons image, by the way, that had crypto in it. So I mean, I think that's just my biggest win of this presentation. But document things and draw diagrams. Most of them don't have it. Review the client applications. Make sure that those are good too. So you can bring those application security skills that you know from the client side and bring them straight into blockchain with a minimal understanding of the SDK. And we're good at reading SDKs, so that helps. A threat model at the component and infrastructure level. You may think that they don't exist and that it's all in the chain, but that's not entirely true all the time. Know the trust boundaries of the application and review the security controls accordingly, and then talk to security people and make sure that there's again that collaborative relationship between the engineers and the security folks. And so with that, I think just in general, kind of wrapping up all the things that we've talked about, what can we do today? And if we go to the next slide, I think really it comes down to all of this finance stuff in security is, and what we found that works is enabling teams, making sure that teams know that they can come to your security team for assistance and partnership, and looking to make sure that what you are doing makes a difference in their world and not just in yours. Being able to measure effectively, so not just going for that success criteria on the top, but also just making sure that you're able to track over time and continue to mature, so that you don't get stuck at a point where you're like, "Yep, we got that done, so we don't have to do anything." Go for deep wins. So what we mean by that is the stuff like key management and secret management, and the stability kind of thing is look for security wins that are a part of a larger project that provide some sort of enhancement or benefit outside of security. If you can find those are the easiest ways to get what you need done, and it also increases the adoption rate of whatever you're trying to implement. And lastly, just cover your basics. I think if we keep going back to, we talk about shifting left, we talk about DevSecOps, we have all these buzzwords associated with security, and I think not enough of us actually do what we are talking about. So if you go back to doing the design reviews and getting back to the basics of what we are preaching, and helping teams understand and do those things, will really, really help you go a long way. And I think that when teams are working together, it's a lot easier to actually do that. So I think just to wrap up, like what we've learned, cloud security is hard at any scale and any project, no matter what. It's always something that you have to think about from top to bottom, that is constantly changing and evolving. I think planning early and adapting often, making sure that you remain flexible and think about flexibility in the future, and try to predict where you are going, is important, as opposed to being a reactive, security person. And then be comfortable with complexity and risk trade-offs. You're not going to be able to win every battle in security. So just being comfortable with understanding what those risks are, and how you are going to mitigate them, offload them, transfer them, is important. It's a lot of CISO talk, but it is important to look at that and understand, what you're willing to lose in any type of security investment. You know.
And that's it.
Yeah, and if you need to reach us, here's our information. I'm Controller Kowalski Security. You can hit me on Twitter at Rolotnik. And also, Mike and I have a podcast, www.r2dso.com, all around DevSecOps and cloud security, if you want to hear more of our voices.
Here, sorry,
People
one
are
more
saying
time.
it's-
Let me try and get that up. So what is that? www.
R2, the number 2, DSO.com.
Cool. So yeah, I'll put that in the chat for you. And are there any questions? Are there any questions for anybody in the chat right now? I have one, so I can kind of stall for time. But if there are any questions, feel free to post them now. The Ken and Mike's information is on the screen, so if you want, you can do it offline too. No problem there. And let me see. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget it. Mike, you were talking about some ways where there were issues about people circumventing the pipeline. So I want to know if you could go into maybe some strategies for locking down the pipeline. You mentioned limiting high access accounts, but how can you ensure that there aren't parallel pipelines?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not easy, but the easiest way is through IEM. So figure out where those privileged roles, privileged users are, and lock it down that way. You know, that's an area where there's a lot of sprawl. There's a lot of policies created. There's a lot of roles created, and you have different places assuming those roles. So kind of figuring out, and there's a lot of tools that can help with this. A lot of the open source tools can even help with this to find those overprivileged roles and figure out where those roles are, figure out where those policies are, and then kind of track it back to that. So kind of stem it from there, because otherwise, if you have kind of sharing of roles, then you have to like track down the different processes that are using to deploy things out, and so it's just kind of a pain to do it that way. So I think going to IEM, determining where you have these overprivileged roles, and then trying to roll things back that way.
Cool.
And that's something you should be doing anyway, even if you don't have multiple dev pipelines. Like that's just analysis you should be doing regularly to make sure your regular users have right access into production or something like that. So
fair enough. And yeah, I wanted to absolutely thank both you and Ken for coming in and speaking to us. I really do appreciate it, and I know I learned quite a bit. DevSecOps is a lot of fun, and you can get into a lot of trouble very, very easily. So I hope that everyone who's watching this, either now in the live chat or in the future, or when this is available on the channel, I hope you all take something away from this. And just last housekeeping things, and if you have any questions, just feel free to throw them in the chat while I'm talking. So again, we are looking for speakers for the year and potential leaders for this overall chapter. So if you are interested in either of those, please feel free to reach out to myself, Abdullah, or Sean. Let's see. There's a question. Ben, are you guys still having a section with people orgs hiring? We sometimes do that in the live when we're in person. We'll let people speak. Here we kind of do something where if you're a speaker, as long as it's not over the top or a sales pitch, we do let you say something if you are hiring at the start or when you're going through your bio. We try to limit that, but we don't have a set period where people
can jump on very quickly or easily.
Yeah. I mean, I, for one, know that I'm inundated with requests like that, where, we have people looking for, hirings and whatever. So that's a whole other issue. So if there's somebody in your, sorry.
Well, one of the other things is we do have an OWASP Nova Slack channel. So that's probably not a bad place to post things like that. We could probably even create a room specific for job postings and things like that, looking for folks looking to recruit or for folks looking for a new opportunity. So that's probably
that's a good call. I can do that right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can create something in the Slack channel. Again, it's OWASP Nova, so pretty easy to find. And yeah, that's all I got. Again, thank you, Ken and Mike. Abdullah, do you have anything before I let Mike and Ken kind of close it out?
No, I think that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. All right.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
Always a pleasure. Good seeing you all again. Yeah. Happy to do this. Love talking about it.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. See ya.